Serious redditors that caught a parent having an affair. What ended up going down? They don't Reddit, but better safe than sorry. I'll try to keep it short. My mother began seeing an old friend of hers, just to hang out, and be friends, and do friend things. But she'd go out all the time with this guy. Sometimes we wouldn't even know where she was, or when she would be back. We being my sister and I, both basically adults at the time also, so we weren't children by any means. Sister gets suspicious and looks through her phone and lo and behold we find sexual texts and implications of meeting for such activities and so forth. We freak out, get upset, consider telling my father, who at the time was hunting up north and wouldn't be back for a few days. We decide to wait and, as my sister can be pretty rash, then decide to confront our mother. Sister does most of the talking, but mother gets angry at us for going through her phone, then accuses us of trying to ruin her marriage, tells us we are awful basically. It was pretty terrible and honestly I don't remember most of what was said, but I ended up making a speech about how it's her own fault if her marriage gets ruined, and she tried to say now we don't love her, and what do we want her to do? Move out, go away. We told her to tell father or we would. She doesn't, wouldn't you know it. He tells us not to tell anyone, and gets pissed that we went through her phone. They're still together, and we pretend nothing happened. There's more but I'm mobiling at work. If you want to know more let me know, and I'll reply on my lunch. It all started when I was 10. My father has multiple sclerosis, and has had it for the last 26 years. He was also a corrections officer, and worked the graveyard shift. My dad was the vice president of the Disabled Drummers Association at the time, and was tasked with completing a new website. Now my father, to this day, needs help doing most things on a computer. My mother had the idea of asking one of the guys at the local computer store, where we bought our desktop, for some books on building websites, because she was going to attempt to do it herself. This is when a young man, around the age I'm now, 28, offered to help my parents build the website. My mother at the time was about 36, and my father was 42. Chris, the young man, started coming over around 5 to 6 p.m. while both my parents were home, and they would work on the website. This website should have only taken a week, or two, tops. It was just supposed to be something simple and informative. Weeks turned into months, and Chris came over later and later as time went on. I started getting a weird feeling about everything. I had a much different perspective of events, because the computer was on the bottom floor of our house, and I was the only one that lived downstairs. The computer was in our family room, a mere 30 feet from my door. I was 100% certain something was going on about 7 months into this charade, when I heard them upstairs watching Saving Private Ryan. I could hear them making out, and to me, I remember it sounding like a sloppy mess, and heard them rounding second and then third base. Needless to say I still have not watched that movie. I heard their conversation slowly progressing as the nights went later and later. To the rest of my family, apparently he had just become a family friend, even coming to my elementary graduation when I was 12. Yes, this affair was going on for years, whether my father was oblivious or chose to believe nothing was happening, as she had cheated once before, a guy named Bob, when I was 6, of which I also knew about, but that story is for another time I suppose. So 2 years later, 3 years later this damn site still isn't done, and he's still coming over, now waiting until after my father goes to work at 9 p.m. One day, in 7th grade, I was 13 at the time, and it was about 1 month before Thanksgiving I finally decided to mention something to someone. I decided to tell my sister, who was 11 at the time, what I knew. She didn't understand, and just kept saying mommy loves daddy. Oddly enough, later that night, my father opened the cell phone bill, which he never did. My mom usually managed the finances. He saw a bunch of calls to a number, while everyone was home. My mom had been having undiagnosed bladder issues, and had been going to the bathroom constantly. He put 2 and 2 together and it finally clicked in his head. He lost his sheet that night. He found out 2 hours before leaving for his 9 p.m. shift on. Had his uniform on and everything. He leaves at his normal time of 8 p.m. because he worked about a half hour away and always liked to be early. 9 p.m. rolls around and I'm still sitting next to my sister and she seems quite confused. My mother sits us down on the couch upstairs and tells us to pack. I tell her I don't want to leave, but she gets angry, starts crying, to guilt me into following her orders. Chris shows up and my mother basically kidnapped my sister and I and we drive to Chris's little apartment in town. It's the middle of the night, so I cannot see street signs. It was a weekend, so I didn't have to go to school for a few days, so we get forced to stay inside a couple days. I still remember the musky smell of his dark upstairs apartment. He had dating books all over his bookshelf as well. I remember hearing them fack while my sister and I attempted to sleep on the couch. Sunday rolls around and my mom decides to take us to see the first Pokemon movie, as I was a huge Pokemon nerd and it had come out earlier that week. Bad idea, because I learned where we were because I saw the local ice rink, Kennedy Ice Arena. I asked to call my dad because I missed him and the first thing I did was tell him where I was. At that point my mother offered to take my sister and I home because she didn't want my father knowing the exact location she would continue to stay at. The next week my mom rented her own house in town. I keep saying in town because I lived outside of a city and so you had to drive into town to get anything. Anyways, she rents this house and comes and gets all of her stuff within a week. My sister decides to go with my mom as my mom was doing a buy your love tactic and I wasn't falling for it. Thanksgiving rolls around a couple weeks later and my father and I make baked chicken breasts with stuffing and mashed potatoes in our empty house. By this time it was more populated with our pets, 3 cats and a dog, than it was with humans. Christmas time rolls around and for the last month it was a string of broken promises from my mother that she would make time for me and promising me she was done with Chris. I finally agree to go spend the night in the spare room at my mother's place and she promises me that Chris won't show up. I agree to go on a night my father didn't work, just in case. Around 11 p.m. Chris comes. Perfect. There is a phone next to my bed, so I call my dad and ask him to come get me. I'm wearing no shoes, no socks, just shorts and a t-shirt. I walk past Chris and my mother on my way out and wait for my dad. It's quite mild for mid-December, so this blizzard is more slush than snow. I stand at the end of the driveway for 45 minutes, while Chris and my mother are standing all bundled up in the garage yelling at me to come inside, not once making an attempt to even brave the weather, to come force me inside. My father finally shows up, and luckily has some blankets in the Astrovan, so I put those on and on the way home I being spewing out the most hateful and cuss-filled rant I have never beat to this day. My parents eventually worked things out, which I believe my dad bit the bullet due to the impending disability the manuscript would strike, which he is currently in the hospital from a broken hip and new lesions on his spinal cord, which in the end was really the best for him, as my mom does take good care of him when needed now. I have moved on from the situation and put myself into therapy a few years ago to learn how to better control my emotions over the situation, and we have a good relationship now. I have had great suspicions that my mom still cheats on my father to this day, as I have found somewhat circumstantial evidence that I never dig too deep into anymore. As long as she continues to help take care of my best friend and hero, I can deal with anything she decides to do. If anyone decides to read that whole thing, kudos. If anyone would ever like to talk or ask about the situation because they are going through something similar, I'm here to help. No one should go through that alone. Through the whole ordeal I was an emotional disaster, as I was the short fat nerdy kid that nobody liked. All I had was my father. I attempted suicide, as did my father during the whole ordeal, but after we realized we truly had each other we got through it together. Our bond to this day is still unshakable. I'm off to the hospital to see him now. Goodbye Reddit. Okay, I'll try to make this quick. Also, sorry for my bad English. I found out one day I was looking for condoms in my parents' bedroom. I was young and couldn't afford my own when I found a letter my mother has written to my dad. We all live together, but my mother has always been more comfortable addressing issues written than oral. Please do not make puns of this. I knew I shouldn't read this, but something in me couldn't put this letter down. The letter basically said something along the lines of I can't handle anymore that you have mistresses. I tried to have my own affairs on my own, but I couldn't really enjoy it. I called insert random my god I name here today to tell him we were over, and now I'd like you to do the same with the other girls. Please think of our children. We need to talk about this. I was in shock. I put the letter back where it was and went back to my bedroom. My now ex-girlfriend asked me what was wrong, and I told her everything I just read. We talked about it for hours. Everything suddenly made sense. My father was always out of town since I was a kid and left my mother and I alone almost every evening. I saw him several times go on vacations with female friends for entire weekends. Hell, even weeks sometime. Some of his female friends even had dinner at our home, with my mother, me and my brother being here. I don't know how my mother managed to handle this for years. After talking with my girlfriend, I decided to never talk about this to anyone else. The day after this one, my girlfriend and I both went to my house and found my parents on the couch talking and stopping as soon as they saw us. My father had tears in his eyes and my mother was looking at her feet. We acted like normal and left them alone. The situation began to change a little after that. My parents looked more happy and my father was a lot more present in our everyday life. A few months later, my parents announced during dinner to my brother and I that they wanted to divorce. My brother, younger than me, was shocked and had several issues about this for months, cause he was just becoming an angry teenager, but I knew what was going on, and that was tearing me apart. My parents decided my brother and I would stay in our house, and they would take turn to live with us. They each found a cheap flat to live in when they weren't with us. That uncomfortable situation went on for a few months, until we began to see both of my parents home at the same time. At first the official reason was cause our house was more convenient for my father to go to work on a specific day, but my mother then began to stay longer at our home cause she was too tired to go back to her flat. And in a few weeks, the familial situation was pretty much back to normal. Everyone was living 24/7 in the same house until they announced us they didn't want to divorce anymore. This was a few years ago, and now I think everything is forgotten and forgiven. My father changed his job and is now at home almost every evening, and my mother started to smile again. TLDR, my father had an affair. My mom knew and tried to live with it but eventually couldn't. They tried to work it out but eventually couldn't. They then tried to divorce, but eventually couldn't. Now everything is okay. Edit. Fixed a few words. Wow, throw away because damn. Buckle up everyone. This one is wild. I was like 0.18 at the time I think. Let's see if I can keep it short. Dad runs an auto repair shop so a lot of the time he drives customers home when their cars break down and he has to fix them. For the record, he's faking shit at fixing cars. One day while I was out with him, I found a cigarette, but in the car that wasn't his. Dad said it was from an old lady customer. I wasn't so sure. Turns out it wasn't, of course. He was having an affair with a drug addict prostitute that he found sleeping in one of the cars on his lot. Mom and I found out the truth at the same time when he left a note on the kitchen table on my mom's birthday telling her he was leaving. It gets even better from there. Mom had a complete mental breakdown and spent months alternating between begging him to come back and screaming at him. She went down to the business daily to try and stop it. I had to call the cops a few times when Dad beat her up for it. This went on until one of the girlfriend's druggy friends smashed her car windshield with a rock and she finally stopped going down there. While all this was going on I had to deal with strangers calling my cell threatening me if I didn't leave the girlfriend alone because Dad was a faking moron and gave her my number, which meant her druggy friends got a hold of it. Life was shitty and it faked me up pretty good. I should probably see a shrink for it but money, no insurance, etc. All in all it lasted a couple years. I wish I had inspirational ending to tell you where we lived happily ever after and Dad withered away, but alas it isn't so. Dad pissed away the family savings on drugs and booze, then the girlfriend left him and he came back home. He's an alcoholic and we are not on good terms. I still live at home for a myriad of reasons. health problems, money problems, the resulting mental problems from this nightmare, and the fact that if I leave mom alone here I worry dad will accidentally kill her one day while he's drunk. She also depends on me for emotional stability. I fear she'll spiral back into her self-destructive depression if I'm not here. One day I'd like to move out of state to the area all my best friends are at, but I have no means to at the moment. It's gonna take another year or two of saving/working probably. Ranting about it to total strangers on the internet is oddly cathartic though. At the time I was 11 my dad worked nights at the bar he owned, and my mother worked during the day. We missed my dad a bunch because he would leave right after dinner for work, and when we got up in the morning for school he was already in bed. My parents had a bedroom upstairs, and I went up there after I heard the phone ring. It was past our bedtime, but I thought that was my dad, and I wanted to say goodnight. I was sneaking down the hallway and eavesdropping as I went. My mother was speaking, so sweet over the phone, and said she loved him. So I opened the door really quick and said, "Mom, I want to talk to dad." She hung up the phone and just kinda looked at me. I was mad she didn't let me talk to him. She sat me down then I told me this huge pile of bullshit, that my dad has pushed her away, and that she was unhappy for a long time, and she met someone who treats her right but my dad didn't know yet. I didn't really know what to say. I believed what she said and said I was happy for her. She ended up taking me to see him one evening. We told dad that we went shopping. At that point I realized how wrong it was. Eventually my mom stayed out all night and my dad, after spending all night worried, was told by my mom that she had found someone else. After 15 years, 2 children and a mortgage, my mom had an affair with a bar fly who ended up dumping her after my dad moved out. My parents are still pretty close, but my dad is still pretty bitter about it. They have been divorced 4 years now. I was 17 and my family, my dad, mom, younger sibling, and I, took a winter vacation to Gatlinburg, TN. While there, me being the antisocial internet nerd that I still am today at 23, used my dad's computer to check up on friends and forums I was on. I pulled up Facebook to post some photos and updates about our trip, but my dad's Facebook page was logged in. One I didn't know he had. On the page he was flirting with other women via posts on their walls. Things like "You are the most beautiful woman ever." I was mostly in shock and spent the rest of the trip even more antisocial and quiet. I didn't tell my mom because my dad had always hammered it into my head not to tell in people. I later learned he had drug and alcohol problems among other things, so telling me this from a young age was probably a way to save his ass in case of relapse, which happened, though I didn't find out about it until later. My mom eventually found out the spring after. I remember because I saw her looking through his phone in their bathroom before she was supposed to go to school, nursing degree. I heard angry whispering, and she curled up on the couch and started crying. My mom never cried. It just wasn't in her normal range of expressing emotions. I left for school and cried there because I hated seeing my mom like that. When I got home she hadn't even left. I asked and she said she didn't feel well. I told her I knew, and I was sorry I hadn't told her before. My mom not going to school was a huge flag for me. She had gone to school awful sick before. Just proof of how bad she felt about it. I later learned even more. He cheated on my mom before they were married. They had gotten divorced 6 months after getting married because he cheated. Then they had me and it stopped a bit. He did it again before my sister was born. My mom is pretty sure he has a son out there somewhere with an old friend of his from a year or so before I was born. The girl kept calling my dad and showed up at the house once asking for him with a little boy who she claimed was his. I tried to find her a few months ago, but no such luck. There's a lot more to my dad's ridiculous issues, but that's just the infidelity bits. We were always super close even after I learned we were practically the same person in mannerisms and interests and academic interest. Only I managed to avoid the drug use and infidelity issues. I'm a little late to the party, but it wasn't great. My parents' relationship was never particularly great. My mom definitely has some latent mental health issues from a tough childhood, and my dad is just rather incompetent in so many ways. On my 13th birthday, right after having a very embarrassing, fight-filled Family meal out, I'm in my mother's room talking her down about why they are behaving the way they are. I had already started to fill the counselor/referee role. She told me she was convinced my dad was having an affair, and I didn't believe that, and told her so, especially since there was no proof. Then I made a mistake. I decided that, in order to prove to her that he wasn't having an affair, I would take his work laptop and search through it myself, since she didn't know how to use a computer. I get the laptop, and just as I'm about to shut it, I notice one subfolder that I hadn't seen yet called personal. I guess I was giving a running commentary during the rest of it, and when I saw the contents of the folder, I went silent. My mom sat up and asked me what was in there. I was speechless, and she saw the computer. It was rather tame, just some pictures of cleavage. Well, that's all I remember anyway. Shit hit the fan. My mom freaked out and dragged me to where my dad was sleeping, and after a bit of back and forth made me on my 13th birthday, navigate through pictures until it was pretty clear that he was having an affair. My mom threw the laptop down the stairs and was very angry. She made my dad call the woman, who was a swinger with her husband, I guess, and I had to talk to her on the phone so that she could see what she's done. She tried to make my dad drive her 2 hours to the town where she lived, but was basically hitting my dad the entire way in the car, and eventually got out of the car on a 12-lane highway and wouldn't get back in. My dad called the cops, and she got arrested for being dangerous to herself. I have a younger sister. Somehow she slept through the night, and when my parents left in the morning to go meet this other woman, she was waking up. So, they left me to explain to her what happened. We don't talk about this much. This happened 11 years ago. The intervening 10 years were hell. My parents have nearly died from each about 8 times now. I've literally pulled knives out of my mom's hands. At least once a month there would be an incident on the level of throwing all my dad's clothes out onto the lawn, or hitting him badly, or something. He's not perfect. He's actually kind of an idiot, but nobody deserves to be treated like that. I always broke up the fights and moderated the screaming matches. I had it in my head that I was already faked up and needed to shield my little sister. I think I accomplished my goal. As for me, it really did fuck me up. We sound like typical trailer trash, but I grew up quite wealthy and of course, nobody knew that anything was wrong. I gained the ability to conceal my emotions regardless of what is going on in my life. On the other hand, I gained a crippling anxiety problem and was very depressed. I had a few really bad relationships. I guess because I grew up observing such a faked up marriage, my expectation of how my partner should treat me was quite flawed. A psychiatrist once said that one of my ex-boyfriends sounded like my mother. It's funny, my mom always used to say that my dad's behavior was going to get my sister into an abusive relationship, but I was the one being abused on the regular by my boyfriend. I'm doing better now. Moving away to school 5 years ago helped, and quite honestly the relationship problems I had, as a direct consequence of my upbringing, ended up taking precedent in terms of dealing with stuff. Now, I have a good job, a much nicer boyfriend, and I'm on a nice, stable path towards success. My sisters figured it out and showed me their evidence, and I didn't believe it. My father was always a moody person and would often have hissy fits and want to be on his own, so it took a while for us to notice anything was off. There were little hints here and there, like when he was suddenly defensive of an adulterous family friend that he'd previously condemned, or when he was writing moody and sappy love songs on his guitar. He started getting phone calls most days around dinner time, and my sister overheard a woman's voice wailing I love you, on a couple of occasions. Then she started to snoop through his emails and search history, and found out that when he'd been at a conference in Vancouver, he'd booked a very expensive hotel in Seattle with my mum's credit card. She was always the breadwinner. I was living away from home when this all happened, and as I'd not seen it in person, I didn't believe my sisters when they told me. My dad was always a bit controlling with my mum and worshipped the ground she walked on. Well, it turned out they were right. He randomly got a job offer halfway across the country, conveniently in the city where a female friend of his lived. It was a big blow to all of us, but a blessing in disguise. When he left we started talking about his behavior and finally admitted to each other that he'd abused each of us separately. He's married to his mistress now, and she's completely unhinged. I haven't spoken to either of them in years, and I have finally managed to get my mental health and self-esteem under control. My mum has an amazing partner now, and I've never seen her so happy. Crazy because this just happened to me last month. I'll try to keep it concise. My mom is in a music group. Nothing big, just a local band who plays around our area at bars and sometimes for town concert series, local weddings, etc. My dad works in safety and would often travel for work and would be gone for months at a time. Recently I moved back in with my parents. I wouldn't always be home, what with work and other things, but sometimes I would come home and my mom would be nowhere to be found. I thought it was odd, because I know my mum's schedule, and I know her, and she's very much a homebody, does not like being away from home for extended periods of time. What I found even more odd was that I would call and text her, and my calls would remain unanswered, and my texts ignored. My mom never ignores me, but then she'd text me a few hours later and say she didn't hear her phone, she was just out for band practice. Okay, I accepted his without question. She's done it in the past, no need to worry. But something nagged at me, and I would think, from time to time, what if something between her and the other guys, she's the only female in the group, was going on? I'd dismiss it, because I didn't think my mom would do that. It was the first week of August, this past August. I had the house to myself. My mom went to visit my dad out of state. They were visiting some old family friends at the time. I was waiting for my boyfriend to drop by so we could hang out. A package my mom ordered came in that day, so I texted her letting her know it was there. She sent me a text to thank me. 2 seconds later I got another text. It said something like, "I miss you honey, I can't wait to hear your voice. I saw you messaged me, and I can't wait to read it." I read it, and my blood ran cold. There was no coming back from this. I knew the truth. Amazingly, she sent another text. "I love you, guy's name. Incredible, right? Too incredible to make up." It was the guy from her band that I always suspected. At that moment my boyfriend walks through the door, and I'm having a panic attack. I finally get the words out. My mom is having an affair. He doesn't believe me. I show him the texts. My mom hasn't texted me for a few minutes, so I'm guessing she realized she was texting the wrong person. Then she texts me, "Don't freak out." She calls me an hour later. We talk. I tell her, if she doesn't tell my dad, I will. We cry etc. She eventually told my dad. They're split up now but not legally separated or divorced. My dad is going through a rough time. I never told my dad about how I found out, or even that I knew about this before he did. And I feel like a horrible daughter for that. Well, it all started with me just having suspicion. My mom just had too many conference and meetings going on that it made me think potentially she wasn't actually going to a meeting. She was very protective of her phone and keeps saying that she doesn't look down upon people in affairs and that everyone makes mistakes. It just raised suspicion for me. I'm not very old, still in high school, so this is kind of messing with my developing mind, but I have already been diagnosed with bipolar, so it probably isn't a huge contribution as to why things are so off for me, but that's irrelevant right now. How did I find out? My suspicion got to me. I searched her room, I went through everything, I look over her shoulder when she texts, but the one that confirmed my suspicion was her computer. The stuff that was on there, literally thousands of chat logs, pictures of many guys, pictures of her with many guys. I didn't know what to do. On the inside I was being torn apart, but then again, I was really fazed by it. It was weird, and I can't really describe the feeling. Some days I'm okay with her doing this, other days it rips me to bits emotionally. That could be partially the bipolar kicking in though, making some days harder/easier than others. What have I done about it so far? Nothing. What is there to do? I don't want to tear this family apart. I don't want my dad to get hurt, because I know this will devastate him. He doesn't have many people in his life, but my mom and my sister and I've known for about a year now, and every night I think about what I'm going to do about it, and very night I draw a blank. I don't want to tell her and mortify her, but she can't be doing this, and I feel like it's my responsibility to stop her. My counselor told me a few things I could do as to confronting her or help in coping with it, but I'm afraid to do anything because I don't want anyone hurt. Long story short, if you are thinking about having an affair on your spouse, just don't. There is a very likely chance that you are hurting someone very close to you. Someone will find out eventually. It is not worth it. I have lost all faith and trust in my mom due to the fact that she could lie to everyone like that. If you don't want your kids thinking that about you, then just don't do it. It hurts everyone, not just your spouse. I knew something was weird because my dad started going on these long walks every weekend. Like clockwork, he would have a couple glasses of Crown and smoke a cigar while he walked up to the country club and back, which was roughly 1 mile away. It happened so frequently it became routine after a while, and no one in my family suspected anything at the time because at that point in my dad's life, he and his brothers, my uncles, were on this weird Cuban cigar kick, and my mom hated the smell of them, so he used that as his excuse to go for a walk. So I was about 15 and just got done running a track meet, and my oldest sister, 21, treated me to a Wendy's Frosty and told me that her friend's reliable sources had informed her that they suspected my dad of faking around with a girl who was 22 or 23 at the time, who went to HS with my sister. As soon as I heard this, I immediately suspected something was weird about all of his long walks. Some nights he would get home really late, and I'd be up on the computer when he got home, so naturally I would get in trouble for being up too late on the internet. Circa 2003, never thinking why is my dad coming home from a 4-hour long walk at 2 AM. I was so naive. Finally one day my sister gets a tip from a friend saying that they saw my dad talking to this young girl at a restaurant, of which I believe my mom was with him. So my sister essentially tracks her down in her car, follows her, and then corners her on some street near my house. So she calls me up, and I drove down and met this woman face to face while my sister had her cornered. I show up in my car, my sister is getting in this chick's face while this woman was on the phone with my dad saying, "You need to get down here, Brad," my dad's name, "I'm being threatened by your kids." My dad shows up, and all of a sudden my heart sank, and at this moment it all became real. Everything up to this point had been hearsay and rumor, but this was finally real. My suspicions were validated in that moment. I told my dad to fuck off and to eat a dick. Told him he raised me better than that, and something melodramatic to the effect of "You're not my dad," or some shit like that. It was a very emotional night, as my sister and I told him, "Either you tell mom now, or we will." So he did, and he packed up a bag and lived in an apartment for about 6 to 9 months. It wasn't an emotional affair, just merely my dad was looking for more sex. The whole thing sucked, but my parents worked through it and are still together today, and surprisingly are doing pretty damn well for a couple in their 60s. It's not something that gets brought up a lot since it was over a decade ago, but if ever there was a moment in my life I could say, and that's when I saw the world a lot differently, that would be it. I was 13 when I found out my dad was cheating. For some reason, I had a feeling inside of me to open up my dad's Skype account on his laptop and then look through his messages. I didn't know what made me want to do it, but I did it anyways. It was as if I knew something that, in all honesty, I really didn't. Anyways, I saw an unfamiliar name in his recent Skype messages log, and I clicked on it. Turns out it was a tenant my dad was renting, and maybe is still renting out to, a flat out to, from around midnight to 3 AM. I read all the messages. Lots of dirty stuff. Unsure of how I felt or what to do next, I went to sleep. When I returned to school in August, read the messages during summer, I started doing poorly in my academics. One thing led to another, and my English teacher sent me to my guidance counselor. I managed to open up and tell her what was wrong. Basically, she advised me to talk to my sisters, married and living 6,000 miles away. As a scared 13-year-old, I didn't know what to do. By the time I was 16, I was fed up. My mind was eating itself from within. I was feeling frustrated. Every time my father pissed me off, it made me want to yell, "I know that you are faking someone who is not my mum." Anyways, my father and I went on a trip to England to visit my family, sisters, uncles, nan, etc. My dad let me go on my own and stay with each of my sister's houses for a night each. This allowed me to tell them what I knew and ask them what to do. Bear in mind, this is 3 years after I initially found out about the affair. They weren't surprised that dad was having an affair. My sisters are my stepsisters, but I regard them as my sisters anyways due to our closeness. They are from my dad's previous relationship. They were furious that my dad was putting me through this pain. Basically, they told me that it is my dad's relationship with my mum, and it's up to me whether I will confront my dad or not. Fast forward a couple weeks, and arriving back at home, I confronted him. I told him that I found out when I was 13. I told him the pain he put me through. My dad sat there silently. He asked me what I wanted to happen. I told him, it's your relationship. I think he is still having an affair with the same woman to this day, but my mind is at ease. I was able to tell my dad that I was aware of what he is doing, and I was able to tell him how I felt. To this day, my mum still doesn't know. I know some of you might be angry or confused about why I haven't told my mum. To be honest, my dad is still happy with my mum, and I think their relationship has only gotten better after I confronted my dad about the affair. I'm now 18 and have moved to England for university. My mum is happy. My dad is happy. The family is happy. After getting divorced, I moved home with my 2 kids. Their house was pretty big. They were traveling about 6 months out of the year. It was the perfect place to just regroup, refocus and figure out what I was going to do next. One night, 2 weeks before Christmas, I was kind of drunk and watching TV. My dad's phone was in the kitchen charging. And I heard a text message come in. Being drunk and an Aussie beach, I looked. It said Eiley. No name associated with the number. And being pretty text illiterate, I had to Google Eiley. I started going through his texts and saw a sheet load of texts. I woke my mom up, and after swearing her to secrecy, I showed her. She was pissed, but not very surprised. I guess this wasn't the first time, but as it turned out, it was the last time. It took about 6 months before she caught him and everything came out. She kicked him out, and they are divorced. My relationship with my dad is really faked up. I pretty much think he is a piece of shit and he treated my mom like shit. But he is still my dad, and we all make mistakes. We'll talk, get along and go out to lunch once or twice before I just have to cut it off again, because I just think he sucks. My sisters are just as conflicted in their relationships with him. Plus, I have 2 kids, and I don't want my feelings to get in the way of him having a relationship with them. It's just really hard, faked up, and it really sucks. They were married for over 35 years. They went through so many ups and downs together. This was their time to retire, travel, downsize and just enjoy life. He is still with that chick, and recently told my cousin that the only reason he likes her is because she idolizes him and goes along with whatever he wants. FTR, the son has not been kind to her. She looks like a dried up prune. Weirdest part about this? My dad was 68 when this happened. I'm in my 40s. And it still sucks. TLDR, caught dad cheating with a doormat. That looks like Magda from There's Something About Mary. Ugh. Okay then. I was 7/8/9 and my dad went away for the weekend to Vegas with some work friends. Supposedly, my mom wanted to surprise him at the airport on his return. I spotted him first and yelled, "There's dad and Sally." My mom perks up and goes, Where? And I see both dad and Sally respond to me yelling at them, and Sally notes the fuck out of there, and she is gone. My mom is still trying to spot her as my dad approaches. I realize something is wrong, so I shut the fuck up. Words are exchanged. I request to go with my father on the drive home. I ask what Sally was doing with him. His story to me was that they both happened to be going to Vegas the same weekend, so they flew home together, but they weren't staying together. I'm literally just realizing how weird it is to give such an in-depth explanation to a child, but he had a whole story. Fast forward 3 to 5 years. Timeline is fuzzy for the first event. My mom catches my dad at her best friend's house. Seriously, and my dad moves out. There are 2 routes I could use to walk to school, one slightly longer than the other. I decided to switch it up one morning and take the longer route, which happens to pass the home that my dad moved into after he moved out, and of course I see my mom's ex-best friend leaving. And fast forward maybe 6 more months and I come across a multi-page document written by my mother detailing all the infidelity. And that's when I realized my father was, in fact, sleeping with Sally when I caught them. Sheety. Obviously a fake name. Editing to say, I mean, it's pretty clear that my mom knew what was up. She wouldn't have loaded up 2 young children for a random drive to the airport to see my father 45 minutes earlier than if we just stayed home and waited. Did I catch him? Meh. But I did spot them first, and it's entirely possible that had I not innocently yelled out their names, they could have seen US first, and she could have made her jet away sooner. My dad used to take me on trip around Europe for father-son bonding. He was actually sleeping around Europe with women he knew or found on the internet. I remember going to Oktoberfest with him and one of my mum's coworkers. Another time we stayed in Brussels for 5 days in some stranger's house. Her son and niece were living in the house, and some of the walls were knocked down and a blanket was hung over the holes. She was not quiet. When we got back from that trip, my mom asked me all these questions about it and everything. I avoided seriously personal questions because I've always hated confrontation. Then she started yelling at me to tell her about the woman she knew he was seeing. A month later they filed for divorce, and honestly it didn't surprise me, since a lot of my earliest memories are of them physically fighting and tearing up the house and my dad leaving for a few weeks before coming back. I had to tell lawyers about the times my dad was cheating on my mom, which was heavy because they were both in the military. Turns out my dad had proof that my mom was sleeping around too, so the adultery charges were dropped and they never showed up in court. My dad got remarried and visited me and my mom from time to time and cheated on his then wife with my mom and hookahs. Anyone who would lay. They got divorced before their first anniversary and he vowed he would never marry again. Still continues his cheating days on wife number 3, and, honestly, it doesn't even faze me anymore. That's just who he is, and who he will always be, but I'll still live with him, because my mom is a religious freak, and won't accept me, unless I'm one too. My dad has a Twitter account, where he calls himself a different name, says he's 34, he's actually 62, and comments suggestively to a lot of women's photos. He's had this account for years. Acts like a charming, friendly guy who can't catch a break. Meanwhile, he treats my family like we're absolute shit and behaves in an entitled way. It sucks to see your dad be super nice and fun. Meanwhile he's got no job and calls us stupid. It feels like a betrayal. I only found out by complete accident this past Father's Day. We got Star Wars shirts and we're doing a family photo. I was going to exit out of his camera app. We used his phone and saw his Twitter next to it. I sent myself some screenshots secretly to further investigate. I was sick to my stomach all weekend. I ended up telling my mom after a lot of worry. She didn't want me getting involved because she knew he'd treat me worse than he already did. Only there was no way to make it look like we found out without involving me in it. Nobody has access to the phone. Still haven't brought it up, but I'm just waiting for the day. I also tried to minfuck with him, which worked. I sent him memes he recently retweeted, which made him concerned for a little while. I sent the link to my friends so everyone could see. I tried to hack his account, just for the ability to make a tweet saying he lied to everyone. Ironically, he always is suspicious of me, because he thinks I talk to creepy people online. He watches catfish specials too. I knew my mother was having an affair years before my parents divorced. She had just made a Facebook account and had been reconnecting with old friends from high school on there, so she spent a lot of time online chatting with them. She had left town immediately after graduation, so she hadn't had contact with many of them in several years. Normal. During this time, though, I noticed some changes in my mother's behavior. She began to dress differently, lost some weight, etc. Just generally caring more about her appearance. And that's obviously totally fine, but for some reason I could just tell that these changes weren't happening for the right reason. She had been married to my dad for a long time, and until that point had been pretty comfortable with the way she looked. She was also Facebook chatting with one friend in particular way more than any of the others. The most obvious change was she began texting more. A lot more. She was texting constantly, more than I was, and I was 13 at the time. This is the part that I'm really not proud of. I started reading her texts over her shoulder. She was really bad at hiding her screen, and was not hesitant at all to text this guy while she was around me, and I definitely had a lot of suspicions at this point. I couldn't help myself. I don't remember any specifics, but I can definitely say that after I started doing this, there could no longer be any doubt in my mind. Another thing I'm not particularly proud of. Even though I was 100% sure at this point that my mother was having an affair, I did absolutely nothing about it. I'm their only child, so I had no siblings to share this with. I ended up confiding in a couple of friends and my boyfriend at the time, but I never told my father. He found out on his own a couple years later, and now they're divorced. TLDR, new mother was having an affair for years, seriously invaded her privacy, proceeded to do nothing about it. Sorry if this is hard to follow. This is my first post on Reddit, yikes. Either by accident, or after some snooping, how did you discover the affair? As long as I can remember, my parents' marriage has always been a bit rocky and stillies. Now that I'm 20. They mostly have difficulties in communication, it seems, or maybe that spark that they used to have disappeared over the years when they got married and had kids at a young age. It was just awkward when one night, while I was hanging out with my dad, he received this call from his recently divorced female friend and kept catching up while I was there. The call did started out innocently, and the conversation stayed that way throughout, but I knew it was probably going to lead to trouble. That call was the beginning of a couple months of correspondence between her and my dad. Eventually my mom found out, and they had a huge fight about it for weeks. They never actually met up, but the sentiments they shared still hurt my mom. I thought it was going to end in a divorce at that time, but they stayed together, I think, for me and my siblings' sake. Maybe if I immediately approached my dad before it got out of hand, it would have saved some heartbreak. But that smile and laugh he had when he spoke to that woman over the phone was a look I have never seen. He was just seemed so happy. So in a way, I felt guilty for not saying anything, but more intensely so at the possible thought of him leading an unhappy life because of his family. Knowing this, it's kinda hard not to say that this hasn't negatively affected my views on marriage. My husband and I are on FetLife. Husband came across a comment with a photo of my father. Yeah, he was dumb enough to post a face photo. Recently, my parents had issues. Mom accusing dad of cheating. Dad denying it and belittling mom over it. I screen grabbed everything and recorded the videos. Way more than I wanted to see. I then left a message on dad's pic saying he shouldn't show his face on public things like that. He denied any wrongdoing, saying he was only looking. I texted him that I knew better and sent him a screen grab of him saying he loved his first bee encounter. He still tried to deny it, and I asked if he wanted the other photos as proof, because I would rather not look at them again. So I gave him a month to tell mom. He didn't. In their therapy he denied everything over and over. My mom was complaining about this, so I finally told her. It sucked bad. First I had to explain why I was on that site and how I found dad. Then she, of course, cried. Then once she told dad, the harassment started. Dad messaged me some terrible things, threatened me, called me names, said I was always a pain in his ass. Honestly, nothing I'd never heard from him. So right now I don't speak to my father. Most likely I won't for a long time. I don't know if they will stay together, and I don't really care at this point. I'm just free of the burden of knowing. Just not the burden of what my dad's dick looks like. Some things cannot be unseen. Alright, first Reddit post. When I was in 7th grade, my dad started going over to my younger sister's best friend's mom's house to talk at least a couple of nights a week. I'm sure that my mom knew what was going on by the time I did, but I remember a few particularly uncomfortable experiences. The first of which was when my dad left the house while my mom was not home and had me tell her that he was going to play pool with the guys. I found it suspicious, but I told my mom the lie anyway. 2 days later we went to a party at our family friend's house and those same guys were there. My mom asked them how their game of pool went the other night and they all looked so puzzled. So my mom turned to me, wondering why I lied to her, and I told her to talk to dad. He of course was sitting with the woman he was having an affair with, as she was also a part of this friend group. It blew up into a really awkward fight, causing my family to all just go home. We actually haven't hung out with those people since. The second instance happened not too long after, late at night, when I was already asleep. I woke up to loud fighting in the living room, which was strange, because they usually fought in the garage, so we wouldn't hear. I come downstairs to see them in a physical brawl with my dad holding my mom to the floor while she scratched at his face. I was absolutely horrified and just stood on the stairs in shock. My mom yelled at me to call 911, but I was frozen in place. They quickly realized how scarred I was and broke up the fight to comfort me and put me back to bed. My parents got a divorce a few months after that, and now, 6 years later, they are good friends and my father is engaged to that same woman. So it all turned out fine, but I don't think parents should ever put their kids in between their marital issues. Wow, what a perfect thread to tell my best friend's story. We met in college via our sorority, so I got to hear the dirty details well after most of her emotional scarring, and her parents' affair story is insane. So basically they live in a suburban area and she's at the local public school in pre-K, makes best friends with a girl in her class that just so happens to live 4 doors down from her in their neighborhood. Their parents obviously meet. They have many play dates from literally pre-K to 3rd grade, being best friends. She comes home one day after school and her mom says she's transferring her to a private school and that she's never allowed to see her best friend again and that her parents are separating. So she's like 8 and her older sister is 12 and they're like, what the fuck? Takes several months of me, either parent, talking about it for it to come out her dad was sleeping with her best friend's mom, who was conveniently divorced. So when they were having playdates, her dad and her best friend's mom were having an affair. Literally almost every day after school. She wasn't allowed to contact her former best friend until she was 15, and even now her mom doesn't really like that they hang out. But get this, my friend, her mom and sister move out of that neighborhood, but the dad stays and continues to date the former best friend's mom. They never wanted to get married or move in. They continued to love 4 doors down. She also remained in private school for the rest of her school career solely because the other child was in the public schools and her mom didn't want them to interact anymore. Last year my best friend's dad, a fair man, was diagnosed with a brain tumor and he finally proposed to the woman he had an affair with. And now my college best friend is stepsisters with her childhood best friend. And she says her parents weren't really suited to each other and the affair was terrible, but they're both remarried now and she can openly talk about this stuff with her now stepsister, so I guess it all worked out in the end. Well, when I was a kid my parents were having a rough patch. So much in fact that my mother inquired me about seeing his emails and how to do so. I was a kid, but I knew a bit about how a keylogger worked, so I placed one on my father's laptop. The way I did it was no short of suspense. He seldom placed his laptop in reachable places, always with him either in his room or office. So the way I actually did it was, for me at the time, closer to a spy movie than real life. I waited until he was in the kitchen doing his after work stuff and set up with my mother to call him with some made up excuse and to distract him for a few minutes. I hid in the cabinet between both places of the house with my 8GB flash drive loaded with the setup for said keylogger. When I felt him going past me, I ran towards his laptop and installed the keylogger. I hid it and made it only open with the combination CTRL plus ALT plus K, something I knew he wouldn't use because he doesn't even use keyboard shortcuts. So after a few days or weeks, I can't be precise, me and my mom did a similar routine so that I could retrieve the dump files containing everything he had keyboarded. Included passwords, programs used, screenshots, etc. Turns up he was cheating on her. I really couldn't believe it when I saw it, but it was right there, in front of me, clear as faking water. Her name, her profession, the name of her faking kids. My mom did a face like she wasn't surprised at all. That was the most heart-wrenching part of all of it. My mom was hurt, and it was because of something I had shown her. To this day I don't really know if I did well showing her that. I could have just told her there was nothing and that my father was not doing anything out of the ordinary, eventually confronting him about it and see how far the situation had gotten. The whole ordeal was the bottom of my parents' relation, and I never really got along with my dad. They separated. TLDR, the movie Spy Kids with added drama. Back in the olden days when whole families shared computers, my dad forgot to log out of his Yahoo email. Of course I snooped. There were emails back and forth between him and some girl named Rachel. There were some that were innocent enough, but then they started getting more creepy. He was telling her when me and my sisters would be at school and my mom would be at work or whatever, and he told her about our dog and just random really specific things. And then they got raunchy. I printed a bunch of them and sat on the info for a couple of days until I couldn't deal with it anymore. I called him up to my bedroom and threw the pages at him. He read them and acted dumbfounded, like he had no idea what I was showing him. He tried to play it off that a friend of his from Florida, we were in Maryland, was using his email address. I wasn't a faking idiot. I told him I could sign up for 1,000,000 free email addresses right now. Why would a grown-ass man need to use some other dude's email? And how would this guy know our schedules? And when you walked the faking dog, T1 point, my mom came in, read them, and they both left my room. I didn't talk to either of them for about a week. My mom finally said she didn't believe he was cheating because she's naive beyond belief or just afraid to admit it. But if he was, I probably scared him enough to stop. It took me a long time to move on. My dad was / is one of my best friends. I was always daddy's little girl and my perception of him being this amazing man was shattered. My parents have been married for 32 years now. We don't talk about it anymore, but I'll never forget. A lot of ground to cover here. So my dad had always, since high school, been a player, and eventually he met this chick online who was much older than him, like 20-year difference I think. And they meet up in person and start a relationship. Not too long after, he starts seeing a couple women on the side, and something happened when he rapped his online girlfriend's friend or something. I don't know the whole story for that. Grandparents told me very little about it. You get the point. Soon enough his online girlfriend is pregnant with yours truly, and he can't convince her to abort me, so I come into the picture. All this cheating goes on for about 5 years as my mother's health starts to decline, gains lots of weight, develops arthritis, bulimia gets worse, ECT, and she dies when I'm about 5. So this is where I start having memories, and I barely really knew my mom, and I didn't learn about how shitty her life was until I was older. So all I really knew was my dad. He would bring home a new woman every few days and they would go upstairs, and I would play with my Legos and stuff and do whatever I wanted as long as I stayed downstairs. I didn't think anything of it for a few years until I'm about 8, and he's been bringing this one particular woman, let's call her A, for a few months, and I'm used to seeing her. I met her kids, you get it. Then I'm introduced to another woman, B, and I'm instructed to never mention the A to B and vice versa. About a month later I meet woman C and he says the same thing again. Every weekend I get told a series of convoluted stories about things we never did together to tell each woman, and I get pretty good at keeping my stories straight. But my dad gets too greedy and slowly they all find out. I gets hysterical around my father and me, yelling and screaming and knocking things over in our home. B leaves without any words, and C stays with him for some reason. Fast forward to today, and he's been with a new woman D for a few years, though he's been cheating on her consistently all throughout. Now that I'm older I know how faked up all of this has been, so every 6 months or so I'll try and talk to him, but he'll pretend he doesn't know what I mean, or that I'm not an adult, so I don't know what it's like. I'll never understand. Apparently woman D knows maybe? I'm not sure, as she often forces me to go with my dad when he goes out of town or to bars, because as my dad puts it, she thinks that if you're here I won't do anything questionable, but she doesn't know about our bond and our system. Yeah, no. I should also mention I have 2 younger half sisters now, one half my age, the other a few years behind her, each to different moms whom I knew for a few months apiece. I don't really know what to do about it now. My dad seems to know what he's doing is wrong and just doesn't care. Woman D is a really bad stepmom and I wish she wasn't around, but it's whatever. That's about it, I guess. My parents were married a few months shy of 25 years. When I was about 10, my dad and I went to an amusement park and ran into a woman from his work. They said hello to each other, chatted for about 5 minutes, and then we went on our way. When I was 14, my dad changed. His personality got really strange. He had always been a happy-go-lucky kind of guy and he always treated me like I was the center of his universe. All of a sudden, he seemed really angry and uninterested in me. My mom and my dad always fought, so I didn't really notice that he was any different to my mom, but I noticed he treated me differently, and sometimes he would say off things. One night after a particularly strange conversation with him, I don't remember what was strange about it. I just remember how it left me feeling. I told my boyfriend at the time that I thought my dad was cheating on my mom. He agreed my dad was being weird, so we spent hours trying to hack into his email, but we had no luck. My boyfriend ended up having to move away shortly after, and we were so heartbroken and distraught over being pulled away from one another that I didn't really think about my parents. I remember my boyfriend and I spending hours and hours on the phone and my dad started screaming at me for being on the phone too much. I burst out crying and slammed the door in his face. About a half hour later, my dad came back really apologetic and gave me ice cream to mend my broken heart and some advice about how I wouldn't feel better until I stopped dwelling on it. I took his advice and went to another boy's house and made out with him. I felt so awful. I just wanted my boyfriend back. I walked home and saw all the lights in my house still on and got this disturbed feeling in the pit of my stomach. Sure enough, when I walked in the door, my mom was on top of my dad, fists flying into his chest, screaming, "Who is she?" About a month after that, my dog died. I'm pretty sure 14 to 15 was the worst year of my life. My mom made my dad come tell me to my face why he was leaving, and for some reason, I said, "Yeah, the lady from the amusement park from 4 years prior." He was all, "How did you know that?" He claims they hadn't been having an affair at the time. I'm 26 now, and it still weirds him out when we talk about it. He is still with that lady and she doesn't remember even seeing us at the park. It was like I disliked her from the moment I laid eyes on her and knew she was going to be important somehow. I don't think I'm psychic or anything, but it was really strange. I found an incriminating holiday card while snooping through one of my mom's drawers. I shouldn't have been in there in the first place. When I read what it said, I can't even remember it now. My heart dropped. I was 12 years old. I didn't tell my dad. I didn't tell my sister. I kept it to myself. The worst part about it all was that the man my mom was having an affair with was her best friend's husband. A few years down the road, say 3, my mom decided she was moving out on her own. Because of the nature of my dad's work, he was rarely home. My mother's new house was also close to my school, so I went ahead and lived with her. Well, her friend's husband, we'll call him Eric, spent a lot of time there. I was infuriated. My mom ended up forming a dependency on prescription medications, had to be committed to a facility because she was a danger to herself and needed detox, and ended up moving back in with my dad. Then, about a year later, she decides she's moving again. I go with her, again. But this time Eric's stuff starts showing up at our house. He is spending more and more time there. One day I look in the hall closet, and it is just full of his personal effects. He had moved in with us, and my mother never even asked my opinion, let alone mention to me what would be taking place. It is worth noting that at this time, Eric and his wife had divorced for possibly unrelated reasons. She was a crazy bitch. I lost my sheet. I wanted to throw all his clothes into the yard and put bricks through his windshield. I felt so hurt. My father had never been anything but loving and accepting of my mother, no matter how badly she faked up. I can understand if he just wasn't the man for her, but there is a way of dealing with that which doesn't involve cheating for years and coming in and out of his life like a swinging door. Well, mom got hooked back on the scripts. Eric couldn't take it anymore and he left. And big surprise, we went back to my dad. Dad was ever so welcoming. Fast forward to about 3 years later. My mom moves into a 1-bedroom apartment. Alone. For real this time. about a year after that they finalized their divorce. Everyone is much happier now. My mom has been doing really well and moved into a lovely 3-bedroom home and is constantly going on vacations with her high school sweetheart, who we'll call Pat. The only catch is now my father is in love with his best friend's wife. It never ends with these people, does it? When I was like 8, I remember going on trips with my father and some woman. My parents were married at the time. These trips would be to places I've never been before and just nowhere near my house, which for me was amazing. I live in San Diego, so we went to Mexico Outlet, mostly to boomers type of places and fun activities like that. I remember very vividly being on one of those swing rides somewhere, while my father and the lady were waiting for me outside the ride. I saw my dad and this woman kissing. Once I saw that, my heart broke. I felt like a huge piece of shit, like this was completely wrong but my fault. Even though I was little and didn't know what cheating was, this really traumatized me. I've had plenty of nightmares when I was little from this. A couple months later my father got caught, and I slightly remember weird things happening, like not seeing my dad for a while and living with family members. My cousin told me last year that my dad was living in the fast lane at that time, having been into illegal activities, earning large amounts of money, and having a girlfriend on the side. Only until last week, I'm 23, I actually talked to a friend about this and realized how much this affected me. I started to break down and cry, some things I hardly do. I just needed to share my experience with catching a parent. It is very traumatizing for anyone, because it's the person you look up to being a scumbag. I hope you can get through this. After my parents decided to divorce, me, 11, and my brother, 16, were in his truck on the way to his apartment across the bridge. We lived in Tampa, he lived in Street Beat. My dad was on the phone with a friend of his, and he's talking about a party from 3 years prior, describing how his new girlfriend that he recently met was there. At the time, the gears turned in my head that he couldn't possibly have just met his new girlfriend, since he just said on the phone that she was there years ago. I turn my head from my gamma boy and begin opening my mouth when my brother turns to me with his finger over his mouth. "Don't you dare tell mom," he whispers at me. "Just forget what you heard and you'll be happier." I confronted him about it during the yearly I Hate You, Dad visit when I was 16. He admitted he had been cheating on my mom since I was about 8, which is when she started putting on weight from the stress of being the only adult in the house with a job and holding herself, a grown man, to children and multiple animals together under the roof of a deceptively expensive house. He's currently a broker subcontractor leeching off his skeletal cougar girlfriend, and her children, who are almost his age, still hate his guts, and I always will. Meanwhile, my mom beat the shit out of malignant breast cancer, is a successful sales agent, lives in a sweet cozy home with her musician boyfriend, and they go on rides on their matching motorcycles all the time. When I was in 5th grade, I came home one day after school to find my family doctor in my house. He was there treating my aunt for the flu. My poor aunt was too sick to make it to the doctor's office and had been locked out of her house, so she was laid up in my parents' bedroom. We lived in a very rural area on a large farm with few neighbors in sight, so our doors were largely left unlocked. Growing up, I thought that man was the best doctor in the world, making a house call to help my sick aunt in someone else's home. That man was a saint. It wasn't until last year, when my mom brought that story back up while we were on a road trip together, that I put the pieces together. Yep, my family doctor was boffing my aunt in my parents' bedroom. My aunt and uncle are still together, and I'm honestly not sure if anyone, other than my mom and I, knows what went down. It's not my place, especially this late after the event, to bring it up. Funniest thing is that I'm pretty sure I wasn't actually aware that anyone was in the house with me that afternoon until my doctor came out and found me watching TV in the living room. I think I probably came home and proceeded with my normal afternoon routine of shirking my homework, drinking soda and eating chips, leaving them trapped in the bedroom until they could concoct a logical story for being there. I have 2 stories to tell. When I was 13, we lived in a 2-story townhouse style apartment. My bedroom was on the 2nd floor over the front door and parking lot. I started noticing about once a week my mom's car starting up and leaving about midnight, but didn't think anything of it. Over time these departures went from once a week to 3 to 4 times a week to finally nightly. Finally my confusion as to why my mom left every night got the better of me, and I asked my dad if mom got a second job or something. He asked me what I was talking about, and I explained the midnight departures. That night, my parents had a huge argument. Screaming, throwing things, etc. Mom left that night and I didn't see her again for 6 months. About 3 days after she left I found a note from her on my bed informing me that she had pulled my sister out of school and they were moving away to live with Ronnie. Dad hired a detective who finally tracked her down, and we got my sister back. During the divorce proceedings, the arbiter asked about us kids, and mom looked right at me and said no thanks, their dad can have them. I don't want them. It took me a long time to get over her betrayal. Fortunately we reconciled before she died. Story 2. 4 years after the divorce, my dad had remarried. Her name was Mary. That summer she met and started hanging around a lot with a single woman named Jeanette who had a daughter about my sister's age, so my sister and I got to hang out around them too. I remember getting annoyed about how much time Mary was spending away from home, but my dad wasn't an easy guy to be around, so I really didn't blame her. The night I loaded all of my stuff onto a U-Haul to move to states away, Mary comes out to the car and tells her that her and Jeanette are having an affair and she was thinking about leaving my dad for her. I reminded her about my dad's past divorce and asked her make a clean break of it with one or the other. Either leave him or break it off with Jeanette. I never heard from dad about it, so I assumed she broke it off with Jeanette. Fast forward another year and dad calls to tell me that he walked in on Mary eating that faking whole lesbian Jeanette's cunt. Without thinking I said something along the lines of, "Oh, they're still together?" He flipped his sheet. "You knew and didn't tell me," and the like. He hung up on me and we didn't talk for a long time. Fortunately, once again, I was able to reconcile with him as well before he died. Holy shit, one I can answer. One day when I was about 14 I had trouble running a computer game. I decided to grab my old laptop that I hadn't used in years to see if it would run better. When I opened it up, right there in front of me was multiple Word documents of rough drafts emails my dad was writing to another woman. I had to wait 2 hours for my mom to get home from work so I could tell her what I found. My mom knows nothing about computers, so I had to go and snoop around my dad's accounts to find more info. I found that he had an adult friend finder account and a couple secret email accounts. My mom was in shock, of course. They've had trouble in the past, but this was out of nowhere. I went to school the next day, and before I knew it my dad was sleeping in the guest room. A year later we sold the house and my father and I have never really had a great relationship to begin with, so I honestly just really didn't care. Maybe I should have more. I don't know. All I knew is that my dad, who has always been kind of an ass but did really love me, was gone, and I get a new house right next to my best friends with high-speed internet for the first time in my life. It was just weird. Everyone acted like my world should have been torn apart. My mom begged me to talk to a professional and even called my school's guidance counselor to call me in and try to get me to open. I just didn't need to. I was a mature kid. I knew my dad faked up. It had nothing to do with me, and it'll mean change, but I was never really that attached to our family dynamic to really get torn up. Part of me feels bad for not caring. Part of me just really didn't care beyond feeling bad for my mom. I'm on mobile, so sorry for mistakes. I was about 7 or 8 when I was home alone one afternoon with my dad, and I could hear him whispering on the phone, so I snuck in the room, and he was talking all flirty to someone, but I knew it wasn't my mom, because she was at work. Well, when she got home I asked her if she had talked to my dad, and she told me no. Why? And I said, well, he was talking to someone on the phone, and he was whispering, and my mom didn't say anything. Well, later on that night during supper, she just flat out said to my dad, "Ivy Cat thinks you're cheating on me." He just kinda laughed, and I don't remember really if he said anything. This is such a long story, so I'll try to cut to the chase. From the time I was in 5th grade until 8th grade my dad had an ongoing affair with his only female coworker, who also happened to be married and with 2 grown children. We'll call her KB, and she was very active in my life and I always suspected they were seeing each other, but never actually said anything to anyone. I would go to her house with my dad some weekends, when my mom would be working, and they would leave me in the living room to play with her stupid dogs, while they went in the other room for 20 to 30 minutes, where her husband was. I don't know. She would pick me up from school. She took me to a concert. More reasons I always thought something was going on is because my dad would never talk on the phone around me and my sister. We weren't allowed to touch his phone or answer his calls. He would stay out really late on the weekend. Just the usual cliche cheating signs, I guess. Well, 8th grade comes along, and it's also my sister's senior year of high school. My dad loses that job with KB because apparently he and their manager had also been seeing her, and they literally got into a fight at work over her. So my parents, who have been together since they were 14 and 17, have decided to separate. My sister and I knew why, but they never said exactly. It was the worst year of my life, and I'm pretty sure I've suppressed most memories from then. Summer comes, my dad gets a new job, apologizes and swears he'll change, so he moves back in. I was staying up late one night and I overhear my mom and dad arguing. She apparently went through his phone and found text messages of him telling KB that he loved her. My mom was devastated. I called my sister immediately because she wasn't at home, and she was pissed and upset just like I was, but luckily for me, I was leaving for a 2-week-long vacation with a friend. Father's Day just happened to be a few days after I left, and I didn't call him, nor did I the whole time I was gone. I would just ignore his calls and messages. When I finally got back home, my parents had still managed to work things out. My mom confronted KB about the affair, and fast forward 7 years later, and my parents are still together. They worked things out, and to my knowledge my dad has been faithful ever since that summer, and I'm grateful. I love my dad, and couldn't imagine my parents not being together. It was the summer between 7th and 8th grade. I was bored and had nothing to do, so I was going through my deleted emails on my computer, because back then you had a limited amount of data for email accounts. I found a bunch of emails to someone's personal email account that I didn't recognize, so I read them and started putting the pieces together. My dad's work email account wasn't working one day, so he sent a bunch of emails to Nadine from my email account while I was at school. Nadine turned out to be Nancy Dean, one of my dad's old girlfriends from high school. I saw him call her baby, tell her loved her. It was so weird, because I was reading my father's love letters to another woman, written in my stupid pink cursive default font on my email account. He had deleted the emails from the sent folder, but had forgotten to delete them from the trash. I freaked out, and after a while called my mom at work. My dad is a professor, so he was home during the summer, and I had no idea what to do. I couldn't bring myself to tell her, so I just asked her to come home as soon as she could. I lasted for about another 20 minutes before I called again, and this time she asked me what was wrong. I read her the emails, and she didn't say anything. She just asked to speak to my father. I brought him the phone and waited outside his study, listening. Nothing happened. She didn't confront him over the phone. I guess she wanted to wait until she could be there in person. I lasted about another hour before I completely lost it. I confronted him, sobbing, and asked him if he even loved us anymore. I will always regret that, because I gave him the chance to cover his tracks and get rid of all the evidence. By the time my mom came home I had already faked everything up. My parents ended up not getting a divorce. They went through counseling, and I had to go through a lot of therapy. My dad did not admit to me what he had done until I was 22, and until then I had no respect for him. I was very difficult to deal with. I was almost kicked out of the house a few times, but my mom always said that if I went then she was going to. Once I left the house my parents' relationship improved 100x over. They are happier now than they ever were before. I have had to make my own peace with what happened and the role I played in everything. It hasn't been easy, but I feel like we've struck a peace. It still sucks though, and I think that I will always have trust issues because of it. A little late to the party, but whatever. This was almost 15 years ago. I was around 10 or so. The family was visiting my grandpa and I, a bored child, had borrowed my dad's phone to play Snake. A couple of minutes after we got there, my gaming was interrupted by a text. I don't remember doing anything. The game just stopped and the text popped up. The sender's number was saved on dad's phone as a contact with no first name, just a surname. Either that or it was a very weird first name. The message read something like, "I'm missing your kisses already." I was like, what the fuck, mate? I was just a kid, but some red flags immediately lit up. Now, being a stupid kid, I simply walked up to dad and asked him, "Dad, who's X?" I don't remember his facial expression, but he answered, "It's just a buddy from work." So either my dad was having an affair, or he was gay and having an affair. Now, I should have told my mother, but I was afraid and didn't say a word. I actually told her about this incident only a couple of months back, but I couldn't shake it off. I had a gut feeling it was a woman. Maybe 10-year-old me didn't consider the possibility of dad being gay, so I faking memorized the number. I become obsessed with it. Me and a friend decided it would be fun to prank call her, so we did it countless times. A couple of months later I got my first phone, so I promptly saved the number there, under the exact same name it was on my dad's phone. One day I did some shit and my parents decided they wanted to snoop around my phone. No biggie, I thought. Then dad found the name and number. Boy, did he get mad. He was pissed, asking me how I got that number, yelling at me I shouldn't have that number. I can't remember what happened after that, but I forgot all about it. Fast forward some 7-ish years, my parents had divorced, mom had moved away, she eventually found out about the cheating before I told her, but that's not what led to the divorce. It was my last year in high school, so I stuck around living with dad. One day we were going out, I think it was some celebration or something, and he said a lady friend of his would be coming with us. Lo and behold, it was the same woman from back then. I don't remember how I happened to connect the dots, I just know I did. And she was faking ugly. My mom looks pretty average, I'd say, nothing special. That woman managed to be uglier than mom. TLDR, dad was banging woman from work, beach was faking ugly. Dad could've done better. My mom has a history of straying. They think that's how I might have been conceived. They're not really sure, because she faked some dude. My parents got back together and they faked, and then I happened, and they've never done a paternity test. Anyway, she cheated on my dad 3 times when I was a child and 3 times when I was a teenager. I found out about one by accident. Dad was at work and I guess she assumed no one was home. I tended to stay in my room when I was younger. She had her boyfriend come over and they start faking in the living room and I hear and come out of my bedroom and find them. I don't really remember what I said or did, but he got dressed and left and my mom started screaming at me. I left, called my dad and told him. They had a huge fight that night and dad slept on the couch for a few weeks. I guess he forgave her because nothing happened. Then a few years later my mom left my dad and went to live with her parents. She got upset at my dad because he didn't come after her like some stupid 17-year-old nonsense, so she started seeing this other dude. I hear about it from her sister and told dad again. Dad goes up to my grandparents and they apparently had a huge fight, but they came back home together, so I guess they were okay with it. That was the last time I know of that she cheated on him. She might be cheating now, but honestly she doesn't go out that often anymore and someone is almost always home, so I really doubt it. But yeah, my mom hates me now. She's really sweet and nice to me, telling me that she misses me when people are around, but then she gets mean when we are alone. I've made a point to never be alone with her anymore because she's tried to hit me several times. She tells me I'm a horrible, abusive daughter who ruined her marriage. Like it's my fault she cheated on her husband. Right. Sorry, I'm a better person. Christmas Eve 2 years ago, my dad had already contemplated leaving several times as my parents were always yelling at one another. Me and my younger sister were awaiting a phone call symbolic of safety from my mother. It is notable I already had my suspicions for months preceding this, so I almost used this as a catalyst to expose my mother's affair. Anyway, my father was asleep in bed as it had just gone 11 p.m. and my sister began to worry. She is quite young and my mother had just gone out to stay at a friend's and would call her before bedtime. My little sister's bedtime of 8-ish, that is. Surprise surprise, it had been 3 hours since we expected a call, so I went ahead and called the girlfriend my mother had supposedly been staying over with. I had her contact number in my phone because she was almost like an aunt to me and we talked quite frequently. I queried said friend as to if my mother was home, half sarcastically of course. Unsurprisingly, the answer was no. Apparently my mum had not spoken to this girl, we'll call her my aunt from now on, for ease, in weeks and definitely did not talk of staying over there. My little sister panics and uses my phone to dial mum 5 times all with no answer. I knew exactly what was going on. My aunt actually drove to our house about an hour later to assess the situation and woke up my father, who joined in on the search for mum. We were all up pretty worried and I couldn't bring myself to mention that she might be having an affair. We were all up pretty late and slept in the lounge. My aunt went home at around 4 a.m. to tend to her own young children. Mum stumbles home around 6 a.m. to find me and dad and my sister on the couch and instantly starts questioning. I confronted her in front of my sister and dad and asked if she had been seeing someone, a man, to which I was replied to with a hard slap across the face. My sister immediately began crying and my dad went and packed a suitcase and left without a word. Dad left that day. I didn't know where he was for a month. Mum dragged me and my sister to her weird drug user friend's house where we just sat worried the entire time, for obvious reasons. A few days later I called my aunt and told her to come get me and my sister. Because my mum was growing insanely paranoid and consequentially behaving in a physically abusive manner towards me, which I didn't like, and my sister didn't need to be exposed to it. Me and my aunt return home later to get my laptop for schoolwork that I've forgotten and find an unfamiliar car parked in the driveway. Yep. We go inside and no one is home, but there are empty beer bottles and pasta bowls over the table and her phone has been left behind too. Her desktop background was her and what I assumed was this guy. I decide to stay there the night by myself and check in with my aunt constantly. My sister continues living with my aunt and I live with my mother, who is abusing me each day for another few weeks until my dad finally contacts me and tells me he has a house for me and my sister. My aunt comes and grabs me. It takes a hell of a fight to get me away from my mother and takes me and my sister and all our necessary possessions to my dad's new house. Mum followed my aunt to find out where we lived and actually continued visiting us when dad wasn't home to hit us for a few weeks until dad got a restraining order. Anyhow, I went off on a tangent, but mum essentially lets this bum of a guy live in the house dad pays for and leech off of her for months on end. Mum forces us to see him and her every weekend and he is a total tool. They broke up a few months ago after he was arrested for attempted theft of a yacht / possession of illicit substances. He took all dad's money essentially. My mum has always been a pathological liar and I don't think I can ever trust her again. She always lies about the men she is seeing and claims men I have seen her kissing are just her friends, so I guess some people never change. TLDR, mum leaves Christmas Eve to have affair with some criminal and then dad leaves just additionally. I'm very safe and happy now. I live with dad full time and his new girlfriend and her children and they are all very nice, so everything worked out. I'm trying to remember how old I was when this all went down. Maybe 15 or so. I'm 35 now, so it's been a while. Anyway, I lived in southern Oregon, near the border of California, where both of my parents are from. My mom had a lot of family still in California, as well as friends, so we would go down there and visit quite often. Every time we went down she would hang out with her friend Mark. We had known this guy since we were kids and were good friends with his daughter, who was a few years older than my older brother. She began telling us that her dad was faking my mom, that she had heard them on several occasions and had even caught them in the act. I didn't really have any reason to disbelieve her, but I didn't want to, and my brother got pissed. I also have a younger sister who was informed about what was going on, but she refused to believe it. Until, of course, one night when we were at their house and went out to hang out in the nearby park and test this whole affair thing. After about 10 minutes my brother and I went back to the door and found it locked. He peeked in through the blinds and started cursing. I looked, even though I knew what I would see, and there they were on the couch, going to town. I asked my brother what he wanted to do, and he said he was going to my aunt's house, a few miles away. He walked off, taking my sister with him. I stayed, and when the door was unlocked I went in and found them sitting at the table drinking coffee and chatting like nothing had happened. My mom asked where my brother and sister were, and I told her they had left. She asked why, and I said pretty sure you know why. She looked horrified that we knew, then got super pissed. We drove to my aunt's house, where I stayed in the living room with my sister, while my brother and her talked in the bedroom. He came out looking very upset, and she came out crying. We never told my dad about any of this, though I know he suspected. Eventually they got divorced, and years later he asked me if she had been faking Mark. I said yes. This is really late, so I doubt anyone will read it, but so many of these have miserable endings that I want to share mine. I found out that my dad was cheating on my mom. We had a family computer that everyone used, and when I was going through really old messenger conversations I found some between my dad and other women. I completely freaked out. Luckily I had been seeing a therapist years previous for depression and had her number handy. I made an appointment and went and spoke to her about the best way to handle it. At this point I had been living out of my car, probably only for 2 to 3 days, because I couldn't handle seeing him at home. I took out my only savings. I was 16, because I knew it was expensive to see her, but she ended up talking to me for an hour and not charging me anything for it. Thank you, amazing therapist. I wrote a letter to my dad and then had him meet with me, just the two of us. I read the letter out to him. I still remember my voice and my hands shaking. It said he had to talk to my mom, and if he didn't, that I would have to tell her what I had found. My dad basically tried to convince me that it would all blow up if he talked to her, but I stuck to my plan. Him and my mom talked and then went to couples counseling. It actually ended up really strengthening their marriage. My mom was abused as a girl and my dad always felt that her needs came first and never felt comfortable speaking up when his needs weren't being met. So obviously lots of counseling and communication went into it, but they are still happily together and have been married for 27 years now. My dad used to take me on trip around Europe for father-son bonding. He was actually sleeping around Europe with women he knew or found on the internet. I remember going to Oktoberfest with him and one of my mum's coworkers. Another time we stayed in Brussels for 5 days in some stranger's house. Her son and niece were living in the house, and some of the walls were knocked down, and a blanket was hung over the holes. She was not quiet. When we got back from that trip my mom asked me all these questions about it and everything. I avoided seriously personal questions, because I've always hated confrontation. Then she started yelling at me to tell her about the woman she knew he was seeing. A month later they filed for divorce, and honestly it didn't surprise me, since a lot of my earliest memories are of them physically fighting and tearing up the house and my dad leaving for a few weeks before coming back. I had to tell lawyers about the times my dad was cheating on my mom, which was heavy, because they were both in the military. Turns out my dad had proof that my mom was sleeping around too, so the adultery charges were dropped, and they never showed up in court. My dad got remarried and visited me and my mom from time to time and cheated on his then wife with my mom and hookers. Anyone who would lay. They got divorced before their first anniversary and he vowed he would never marry again. Still continues his cheating days on wife number 3, and, honestly, it doesn't even faze me anymore. That's just who he is and who he will always be, but I'll still live with him because my mom is a religious freak and won't accept me unless I'm one too. Oh boy, here we go. So about 2 years ago, my mom was traveling a lot and her most frequent stop for work was New York. We live in California and she would stay there longer than anywhere else because of a bad local. She works for the International Union and such. Anyways, she had been cheating on a guy we will call Andrew, who was from England. My dad found out, but never told us. He found out because she left Facebook open, and the only reason I know this is because I went through their texts when I started to get suspicious. Please note, I was in 7th grade. Then, this summer, my dad started going out a lot, and turns out he had started cheating as well. When my mom found out, she told me, 14, and my older sister, 16, and got us to believe my dad was a horrible human. He was out for 2 weeks, and my mom started drinking tons. She had been an alcoholic for a while, and made no serious attempt to stop drinking, but this was insane. Anyhow, when my dad came back, we started trying to make up with him, and my other sister had just come back from SoCal, and was amazing this whole time. That night, my dad left, and 2 hours later, my sister, let's call her N, the oldest, 21, found my mother passed out underneath her bed. She was responsive, but had no short or long-term memory. We called my dad, and then called the ambulance 4 hours after that. When she started to sober up, she blew a .208, so she was in danger of poisoning while she was at the hospital. My dad was amazing, and the most stable one in the house, so we stuck to him. For a while, it was tense, my mom saying she didn't need to go to the hospital and such. My aunt came up to help her, and stayed for a few days, which helped her recover from it. Then, she went to Toronto to relax, and came back drunk as hell. She drove from the San Jose airport, which was an hour away, to our house very drunk. For the next 3 days she was constantly drinking. She still doesn't remember any of it. Things were insane, as I had to carry her back to her bed when she passed out, and well, yeah. Now she is in rehab, and it's going to be a while before we can move out. My parents got together as teens, and my dad actually broke up with my mom a week before she found out she was pregnant with me, so they are absolutely only together because of me and my brothers. I've known my whole life, so it was no surprise whenever I discovered their infidelities. Yes, plural. The earliest incident I remember is back when I was 10 or so. We still had a house phone back then, and when it rang I naturally answered. This lady on the other line asked for my dad by name. I asked who she was, and she said, this is the woman he was sleeping with last night. Now I realize that she could been lying or whatever, but as a kid who knew full well what sex was and what sleeping with meant, I was severely upset, but I was shy and afraid of my dad, so I just handed over the phone and didn't say anything. A year later, I realized my mom's male friend was really her lover, and that's why she was spending a lot of time at his apartment. A few years after that, when I was 16, my mom had an affair with a married man who also had kids. At first I was mad because I didn't want my mom to stoop to my dad's gross levels of infidelity, but after talking to my mom about it, I realized that they were both in love, and that the husband's wife knew and let it carry on because the man and my mom made each other happy. My mom ended it though, because she realized it wasn't healthy for either of them. That incident didn't change my mind on cheating, but it showed me that there's always multiple perspectives to affairs. TLDR, my parents have always cheated on each other, but while my dad cheated for sex, my mom cheated because she wanted to be loved. I didn't catch my dad's affair, but my mom found out. He was supposed to travel to a different city with his buddies, but the flight was cancelled. He didn't come home, but his buddies, neighbors, did. My mom heard it from the wives of my dad's buddies probably. Then hell broke loose. They never fought openly or on front of me, but my mom started drinking and weeping at night. I still remembered one night my mom was real drunk and crying on the bed half asleep. She started to puke on the bed. I happened to see it. My dad was so fed up that he asked me to smash the big alcohol jar in the house while he cleaned up my mom. That was in the middle of the night. This drama lasted about half a year. My dad probably considered leaving my mom with his new woman. He even took me to see her from time to time. I still have memories of my mom repeatedly telling me the woman my dad took me to see is a tramp and will murder me if she becomes my new mom. Eventually, they decided to stay together for the sake of me. My dad never went back to see the other woman, but it seriously changed my mom. She repeatedly tells me that I'm the only good thing in her life. She sacrificed her life for me and can't live without me. Unfortunately, it didn't bring me closer to her or my dad. I use every opportunity I had to move away from them. A part of me wishes they divorced back then. My mother is a serial cheater. I've caught her on many occasions. The first time was the most eventful though. I was 15 and sitting on the roof of my house when a car pulls up totty front of my house and my mother and her workmate walked out. I thought nothing of it until I saw them kiss. I ran downstairs and I confronted her about it. She attempted to cover it up by saying they were friends. I told her friends don't kiss each other like that, and I think it is important that she confesses to my dad. He doesn't deserve this treatment. He sold important possessions to him to bring my mum over from another country, and it wasn't right that she take advantage of his good nature. She begged me not to tell him, and I told her she had 1 week to tell him. She showered me with gifts and money, and every time she presented anything to me, I told her that she only has X amount of days to tell dad. At the end of the week she told my dad. He was heartbroken. He didn't sleep, barely ate or left his room for 3 days. Then after that he came out fine. Like it didn't even happen. I guess they came to an agreement because her boyfriend moved into our granny flat and dad said nothing. That man is no longer in the picture now, but she is traveling to Europe to see another man she's having an affair with. Dad also knows about this man, but when I ask him about it, he always says that he doesn't want to die alone. The love of 5 children is not enough love for him to be happy, that he's rather stay in a toxic marriage. It so befits my fortunes that this is one of the few Ask Reddit threads I can answer. Went to print a project for university one morning. Dad didn't log out of his clandestine mail account. Saw enough to tell me that he was messing around. It was simultaneously a huge surprise and not a surprise at all. Not one because my parents have pretty much always been on war footing, but still was one to some extent. Was because I didn't think he would do it. Couldn't really properly process it due to the hurricane. That was 4th year. Decided not to tell mom because I reasoned he would either miraculously repent, cease and desist, and scuttle all the evidence, or sink deeper and get more careless, eventually failing to cover his tracks, and then it wouldn't matter that I hadn't told her. He went down in April of that year. Mom and dad were outside talking when my car pulled up, and then they went inside. Seismometer was tingling, and mom pulled me aside and told me she found out. Initially felt betrayed because I didn't tell her, but later understood. Health insurance for the Viagra did him in. Things exploded. Dad was kicked out for a while, then was allowed back in, whereupon he attempted suicide and landed himself in hospital for a couple of months. Things cooled down over the summer. In fall they bought a new house together like idiots, and the winter was going fine until dad lied about something relatively inconsequential. Mom bucked, and dad attempted suicide again. Now we are here, in another cool stretch. I'm spent. I don't know what to think or want anymore. I'm just working on getting out. I think that would be best. When I was 13 my best friend called me on my mobile phone one day. I just saw your mom kiss a man that's not your father. I was not really shocked because me and my younger sibling already had her under suspicion for acting really shady, but it was still not something I was prepared to be confronted with like this. She kissed him a semi-public place, and I guess she saw that my friend was there, because later that day she told me I should stop seeing her because she was a bad friend and not trustworthy. Obviously she tried to do damage control by making me doubt my friend and try to make sure I would not believe her if she was going to tell me what she saw. I felt sick afterwards and didn't know what to do. My mom just lost a bunch of weight and her and my dad was fighting almost daily at the time. I felt bad for my dad, but he was drinking a lot and didn't really listen when my mom told him what was wrong and how to fix it, and I kind of understood why she could not cope with it anymore. I never told her that I knew. The affair continued, and she moved out without warning when my sister and I was on holiday with our dad. She was supposed to come along, but cancelled when we were about to leave. I don't know what she told my dad, but he was drunk every day on that holiday. He drank so much that he fell asleep every afternoon in his camping chair, and since my sister and I was 13 and 15 at the time, we found other things to do around the campsite and made some friends, so we didn't have to sit around and watch the disaster unfold. I still feel sick thinking about that horrible holiday. I think he knew she was going to leave, but they didn't tell us anything. When we got back she called me when we were almost home and told me she had left and that she would find somewhere for us to live soon. We didn't see her much that summer and my dad was a wreck. He didn't understand why she left and he started renovating the house because she once told him that she wanted that. I remember him calling her at night and babbling drunk that he fixed the washroom and would eat better and that she could come home now. They met in 4th grade and was together for 35 years. It was very hard to see all of this. My mother was obviously living with her boyfriend, but would tell us. She continued to hide it for 2 more years. Then she introduced us to him as someone she just met. But I knew better, and I had known for at least 5 years at that time. My dad got another wife, but she actually also just left him. I hope he won't start drinking as much this time. My mom is still with her boyfriend. Neither me or my sister has never once confronted her or told her that we know that they have been together since I was at least 13. She thinks we don't know, or she just does not want to talk about it.